just a quick note of intro. My name is Vincent. I've been working with Ayden on the carbon side initially for Bosa properties for now 2 years. And we started the initiative, first and foremost, sorry, my English is okay, but my accent might be a bit confusing sometimes. So if there's something that comes across and you don't understand, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'll happily repeat and clarify. We've started the exercise coming out of a strategy session that we run internally, identifying carbon as a threat to our business. It was a big word initially, but a bit of a background on that. Our brand is very strong in Canada, and a brand is an inferred value, something that you cannot really measure. And we talked about carbon as something that's very measurable and that comes out more and more measured as time goes. So we sort of saw that ignorance in carbon as something that could damage our brand. And therefore, we started to look into it and educate ourselves on why it either could be a threat and remain like that, or maybe become a competitive advantage. So Ayden has done an amazing work to do that education, John, that you're talking about in-house with all of our executives, all of our senior leadership team, and even down to our development manager team to help understand why it matters to us and how it matters to us. So, that presentation sort of goes through a little bit of the beginning of the exercise and then more lately what we've been doing both with the City of Vancouver, but also with our consultants partners, the builders, and the rest of the development community. We're a bit differentiated in the fact that we don't only develop, we're also a builder. Part of our group is a company called Axiom that builds all of our properties. We operate mostly in the Lower Mainland, but also a little bit in your country, in Seattle, and more recently in Nashville. We have a portfolio of, I think, I'm going to say something dumb, but it's probably 12,000 residential units, and just as much in the portfolio of development right now. We develop, we build, and then we own and operate most of those properties with teams on site that manage our communities. I think that's about it. So please, Ayden, if you want to start.
So that was a perfect intro. My job primarily, as Vincent said, is to been educating our group, but also to educate us primarily and be staying up to date on these topics. So we thought we'd take you through quickly what we're doing up in Canada, but also in Vancouver, and try to relate that to what you guys are doing. Similar to what your country's previous /goals are currently. By 2030, we're trying to reduce our greenhouse gas by 40 to 45% compared to 2005 levels. And then also in 2030, we want to reduce our buildings emissions by 37%. So our building sector, especially in Vancouver, is our highest emitting subsector. So there's a huge focus on that. In Vancouver, sorry for all the text, bear with me, but in Vancouver specifically, when we look at embodied carbon, we're targeting 40% by 2030. We currently have bylaws that are in the process of changing. So in 2023, what happened was the City of Vancouver said all new Part 3 buildings, which are any buildings that are over 3 stories or over 600 meters squared, had to measure their embodied carbon. They set a limit at first, but 800 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, as we all probably know from your last workshop, very high. It's just to get everyone to start measuring. April 2025, and this is what we're working through with the City of Vancouver right now, is to set a lower limit. So 380 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, or a 10% reduction to that baseline. So again, what is that baseline? Great question. We're still trying to figure it out and come up with, is it a base building or is it this prescriptive number, sorry. What happens is there's 2 embodied carbon studies that happen for any Part 3 buildings. So first at rezoning, this process is very estimated. Obviously, there's not a lot of specifications at this time. So this is estimated based on building size and building typology. The goal here is just to inform the future design. They really just want to see that you have a plan moving forward. The second is that building permit, and this is where estimations are not accepted. You have to use your actual specifications within the building to come up with your embodied carbon calculations. Here's to prove that you are meeting in 2025 that under 380 kilograms of CO2, or meeting that 10% reduction, and then explaining how you got there as well.
Just sorry, maybe a bit of a color on those all those words. So rezoning is a very rough letter of intent, as we call it. So you have square footage, use, massing, a little bit of focus on how you address ground plane, but it's a very high level level of detail. Building permit is probably a little bit more advanced at your SAP, but not so much. And the processes here are either performance-based or baseline. And so that 380 kilogram per square meter that Ayden mentions is that prescription. The city of Vancouver established a baseline of 400. We have to reduce from that, but you can still prove what is your baseline project value and explain how you're going to get to that 10% reduction from there. The focus on those measurements is around structure, envelope, and I think that's it.
Closure?
Envelope and closure.
Oh, sorry.
And you don't take into account any of the, there's a slide about that for the life cycle, but they're trying to tackle really the biggest emitters first, and they're trying to have you work on either those efficiencies, or if you're not a very sophisticated developer that has the capacity to do those, give you a baseline with. You can find on the link that I put there, there's a lot of descriptions of all of the baselines for each type of material and each type of component of the building. It's very prescriptive and actually quite thorough. So that guide, there's a good example there.
Do you have requirements based on the studies, or is it all based on project type or scale?
So we rezone when we want to go past or beyond a potential zone use, and that therefore there you would have to explain what was that? Sorry.
The rezoning trigger.
Yeah. So if you're in an industrial zone, you want to build some residential and office, you do a rezoning process, give that letter of intent, and give the embodied carbon calculation. Now, at building permit for about 3 buildings that are all of those buildings over 7,000 square feet and 3 stories, which is a big bucket of everything, really. There's that trigger for embodied carbon too, and I think that's where it still needs a lot of refinement. The city has sort of packaged all of the buildings together without discerning uses, structures, or even location, which makes it a little hard to comply to a baseline performance.
Any other questions? I won't linger too long on this. Quick preface. Percentages varies depending on where you are around the world, so 55% might not be true here. But the structure, what's the most important part here is just the share of emissions. Obviously, your product and manufacturing, there's a huge chunk of percentage of emissions there. What's important to note is the structure and closure are the biggest share for you guys based on your slides that we saw earlier. So when we're looking at our policies, as Vincent said, it's focusing on those two and what are the most impactful solutions to reduce on those areas. Yeah, sorry.
So your 3A cap is on structure and enclosure, superstructure and substructure, and then it's B to C at 60 years.
Yeah.
With an exception of B6, that's the operational.
Again, I won't talk about this for too long either, but the whole point of all of this is to not get in the red zone.
Well, sorry, just to go back on why. So it came with a bit of a sanction for us. Like, okay, well, we have to comply to those policies. We have to pay for all of it. Nobody really cares. Why are we going to have to do that? And it really triggered the question of, okay, why? And diving into what is carbon, why carbon, and understanding where it was coming from. And it forced us to sort of take a step back on how we could make of that sanction something that can differentiate us. And so we've dived into a lot of detail about which are the institutions that dictated this initially or recommended this initially, and then how was the finance world reacting to it. And so looking at institutions that disclose their emissions, looking at financial sustainable groups, looking at sustainable finance and other larger institutions, we sort of looked at, we understood that they were modeling actually what was the outcome, economically speaking, if you were to not do anything or take better steps at reducing carbon emissions, which like really directly go into the greenhouse gas emission, as most of these gases are carbon, like 80% of it. When we looked at that, we then sort of mapped what are the mandates and who are the stakeholders in that reporting structure. Coming from a very high level government, the Paris Accord, and then rippling down to financial institutions and publicly traded corporations that are the ones that really do the work of reporting, measuring, and trying to align to those accords at the very high level. And then lower to the business owner and more so on the operational side, because it's really where the emissions are currently measured and reported. And then finally, the last layer, the dwellers or investors that are the end users. And we looked at those, both the downstream mandates and requirements and then the upstream reporting. We looked at what are the dates and how those emissions were separated, and then understood that 2024 was not really a big day. You have to report on your scope 1 and 2 emission if you're a publicly traded institution, and these are really related to your operations. But then comes 2025, these institutions would have to report on their scope 3 emissions. And that's where we saw an opportunity for us to create more trust with these institutions and also give them a lot better information. We talked to a lot of consultants and they explained to us that typically banks were using dollars invested and a proxy when they were reporting their emission on scope 3. And we double clicked on that and understood that that proxy was actually very penalizing and was not really related to what the scope 3 emissions really were. If you compare an investment on a project to actual emissions of the project, you sometimes have a 6-time difference between what are the real emissions evaluated by LCAs and what are the banks accounting for in their reporting streams. So we talked to a lot of banks, Canadian banks, BMO, CIBC, and TD Bank, and they all told us we don't really know what we're talking about, but for sure the inventory that we carry is pretty heavy, and there's more and more interest on our end to prove that we're doing our part to align to those emission threshold and limit that were set up by the governments. So we thought, well, let's try to evaluate at least how much our property emit, and especially south of the border, where we're trying to attract capital partners to pair with us on projects and invest in our constructions. We realized that, the difference is significant. There's no yet financial benefits to actually understanding all of those, but by providing this information to your partners, you create a very strong relationship based on trust and expertise that you can bring to the table with them. Sorry, that was a long one. The one layer that we're still we're like, well, nobody really cares there, is the end users and dwellers. And in our world of multi-family residential building, it was sort of crystal clear. It's a table stake to be sustainable. People care about it. They want you to perform, but they don't want to pay for it. And that was the bottleneck for us, because if nobody's going to pay for it, it's going to land on us. How are we going to do that? Ayden, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the impact of residential housing and how it's projected.
We're currently within a housing crisis in Vancouver, so specifically for us, relating building more housing and embodied carbon was really important, because the city of Vancouver is grappling with this. They're also not doing it on the operational side for emissions. They're not wanting to set limits for multifamily because they're worried about affordability. So we asked ourselves this question: how can we be building more housing but at a lower embodied carbon? And we know that residential construction in Canada specifically is our highest emitting subsector. I said this earlier. But how do we be building more with less impact? And when we saw the statistic that we need to be building 130,000 to 225,000 new homes per year, the carbon impact, when you quantify that using an intensity, is quite significant. So this really brought the question forward to us. We also really love this graph as well. When we look at what current 2018 data was on the embodied carbon in projects, and then what we were trying to get to in 2030, this left-hand side of the graph there, versus what the emissions are when you look at annual construction demand and what we need to be building. We should be reducing the carbon from those homes by 83%, not the 40 that we're talking about. So this is a whole nother 40% that we're adding. Again, looking at that, not just looking at what's existing, but looking at what we need to be building for the future. This is quite a drastic change we're talking about.
So it felt like we're doomed. A, we have to reduce. B, we're not taking the right baseline. C, we have to build twice as much. It's impossible. And again, back to that question: who's paying for it? Nobody wants to pay for it. Our customers who will eventually live in those houses don't want to pay for it. So we try to understand, okay, well, what are we really measuring? And again, the why. It appears that when you report on those Part 3 buildings in Vancouver, you don't account for a bunch of services and all of that, but the infrastructure that you account for that's on your private property is very different when you build a dense high-rise construction compared to when you build sprawling low-rise or even mid-rise or even more single-family homes. So we reviewed all of that, and I mean, those graphs are pretty self-explanatory, but there's tendency of building on the low density side bigger homes for smaller households, and on the more dense side, smaller homes for just as big households. So we felt that, well, the customers don't really want to pay for it, but they're already actually doing their part. If they're choosing to live in a denser housing model, they're contributing to reducing the embodied carbon and overall emission impact on the city, because most of the footprint that they take for themselves is coming through reducing their house size. So all of these graphs show you that maybe the metric that we're considering of square meter or square feet is not really appropriate for housing. Furthermore, we moved on studying what our customer really care about. And so these are customer study that we run on every project, really, where we ask people, what do you really care about in your building? And therefore we'll orient our vision to respond to those criteria. What came out of looking at that graph with the lens of embodied carbon is that people don't really care about any of the building part. They care firstly about the location, the quality of the building, the price of the property, the building security, and a little bit about interior design. And then there's like 3 big buckets where you can translate almost embodied carbon to the customer interest, but it's very much lower on the list. So, well, we felt maybe if we don't understand what do they care about on the embodied carbon side, we can get rid of the things they don't care about. And that sort of talks to the graph on the right side of the picture, where we're going to build less, and we're going to take away all the things that people won't pay for. And looking at actually design efficiency as a real sustainable effort to reduce the embodied carbon footprint. So we started dissecting our properties. And I think, so I've been doing that on the commercial side, and it's a study that you do as a consultant and architect when you start on a project. Efficiency is a key driver. You chase square meters everywhere you can, and you're building shell and core, so you have a lot more time to focus on those areas where efficiency matters. In the residential world, we never had to do that. Industry was like a fast-paced thing, and the faster you build, the more likely you were to make profit. So we took a closer look at all of our properties and created a way to benchmark our properties. So these are anonymized building, and we have the data for all of our projects, but you can see that we created a platform to sort of understand key metrics and how they translate to customer value. And through that, looked at what were the impact of those metrics on the embodied carbon. So for example, on the parking side, we measured how many square feet do we need to build a parking stall. And as you can see on the plan to the right, people care about having a stall, but the space that's after the stall, between the property line and their stall, nobody cares about it really, and nobody will pay for it to you. So we chased all of those numbers, we chased all of these inefficiencies, and by doing so, really brought the benchmark value to a more reasonable place and be more meaningful and with intent when we design programs and projects around those metrics. Another one was obviously the core of the building, where, I mean, you have 40 stories, you chase even 50 square feet, on per floor plate. It's a huge bump in efficiency, and it's a huge carbon saving. So we started really looking at meaningful information for common corridors, elevator lobbies, elevator shaft, egress stairs, and giving directions, working closely with trades, but also with architects and municipalities to make sure that those areas were not overbuilt. All of those, again, gave a huge bump in efficiency and a huge cut on the embodied carbon side. We did the same thing for amenity size and lobby size, and we look at those with not just, in the US specifically, amenitizing buildings is critical for you to bring people in, right? But there's a tendency to just over-design there. So we started to benchmark how much amenity per unit do you actually want in your building, and we saw that you can see the gap between properties is massive, because it was left to architects to really give you their recommendation as a developer, and people would usually follow that. Now there's a much a better understanding on our side of what we want, and it's not that far from what the customer wants. We're trying actually to push the envelope a little closer. Finally, on the envelope side, trying to understand massing complexity through really analytics. And that's something the development managers are struggling with, because architecture, volume, massing is something you need training to really understand. With those metrics, our development managers have now flags that are raised automatically once their ratio goes over a certain limit. They don't know what the solution is, or they don't know what the problem is, but they know they have to look at that a little bit more detail with the architect. And so is it the floor to floor that's too high? Is it your massing that's a little bit too articulated and recessed? Then we can double click and try to understand a little bit more where to work there. There's 60 metrics like those that we chase around our properties and benchmark. We have different benchmarks for different uses, because again, whether you build a hotel, you build a retail, a commercial property, a rental property, or a condominium property, stratified, those metrics will be different. What we've worked on with the city of Vancouver is to actually build those baselines for Vancouver standard per type of use. And rather than bucketing everything in a part 3, what they call part 3 building, really have metrics that align more with the use of the building and the typology of the building. Once you start to really chase those inefficiencies in the building, you can see that for equal number of units, an equal parking ratio, and a slightly more aligned amenity size and lobby size, your efficiency is increasing significantly. And because you're still bending the same revenue but with less hard cost, obviously your profit over cost jumps through the roof, which was very exciting for all of us, because not only we're building more sustainable, we're also building a lot more profitable properties. When we relate that now to a unit that we think is more appropriate, which is the carbon per housing unit, you can see that the footprint is reduced by 10%, and not just on the unit basis, obviously, on the whole property basis. Good. So, please.
I think the main takeaway here is in Vancouver, we've lumped everything together. Industrial, office, no matter what you're building. It's over 3 stories or it's over 600 meters. It's all the same, apparently. I think ULI has done some great work on this. University of Toronto is doing work on this. There's so many institutions that are working on trying to separate different use types. And especially when you look at multifamily, to Vincent's point, the kilograms of CO2 per meter squared maybe isn't the best way to go, especially when you're trying to prove reductions. When we're looking at the per unit, it makes a lot more sense to us looking at it that way. What we have not done the work on, someone else needs to do this, is what it means, what the correct metric is for office, what is the correct metric for industrial, what is the correct metric for a hospital. When we went to Nashville, we posed this question to the audience there, and yeah, everyone kind of stared at us and they were like, I don't know. So clearly there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this, but we hope that on the multifamily side, this makes sense. And especially when we're trying to relate the cost side of things and the profit side of things to embodied carbon. Someone earlier was talking about wanting to create the business case for it. This is it. And so, yeah, it's just trying to define what that is for the other uses as well and gathering the resources to do that. This is very new. I don't think anyone else is looking at it how we look at it, but this is a perfect time for you guys to look at it as well.